My wife used the language of boundaries and self-respect to justify monitoring my phone, isolating me from friends, and holding our marriage hostage over a list of demands that grew longer every year. When it finally exploded on a beach in Portugal in front of strangers who had no idea what they were watching, everything she thought she'd secured started to fall apart. My wife once told me, with complete sincerity, that checking my phone while I was in the shower was an act of self-preservation, that she had a right to protect herself, that any man who objected to his partner having access to his messages clearly had something to hide. She said this in the way she said a lot of things, framed just carefully enough that pushing back made you sound like the problem. I heard a version of that argument for 6 years. It took me almost all of them to understand what was actually being said. Her name is Priya. We were married for 4 years and together for 2 before that. I'm going to try to tell this plainly because the story is complicated enough without me adding drama to it. The drama was already built in. We met through work. Not directly, she worked at a client company, and I was on the account team that serviced them. We overlapped at meetings a few times over about 3 months before she suggested getting coffee to talk through a project detail. The coffee lasted 2 hours and had nothing to do with the project by the end of it. She was smart. That's the thing I want to make sure I establish first, because smart is what made it work for so long. She was analytically sharp, good at reading a room, capable of making an argument that stuck. She had strong opinions on most things, and she held them in a way that seemed principled rather than rigid. I was drawn to that. I'd been with people who were easy to be around, and it had always felt a little flat. Priya never felt flat. We dated for a year before I moved into her apartment. That was the arrangement she suggested, and I had a lease ending anyway, so it felt practical. In hindsight, I think the practical framing was deliberate. She was very good at making things that served her interests feel like neutral logistics. The apartment was hers. Everything in it was hers, arranged by her, operating according to her rhythms. I brought boxes of my things and slotted them in where they fit around her life. That's a dynamic that's easy to name in retrospect. At the time, it just felt like we were figuring it out. We were engaged after another year, married 6 months after that. I want to be honest, I loved her. I loved her all the way through the bad parts, even when the love was complicated by exhaustion and confusion, and a kind of grief I couldn't name yet. I'm not telling this story because I want to paint her as a monster. I'm telling it because I need to process what it cost me, and maybe because someone else is living in the version of it that I lived in, and I want them to recognize it. The first real warning sign came about 4 months after I moved in. I had a close friend named Adriana. We'd been friends since university, the genuine, non-romantic kind where you've known someone through enough life stages that they just become part of the architecture. She was sharp and funny, and we talked every week or two, met for lunch a few times a year, occasionally went to events together when Priya wasn't interested or available. Priya didn't like Adriana. She didn't say it in those words at first. She said things like, "I notice you seem to prioritize time with her, and I just want to make sure we're both feeling like the relationship is the main thing." She would mention Adriana in a particular tone that was hard to exactly characterize, not hostile, just slightly weighted, like the name itself carried a small question mark. I told Priya clearly and more than once that Adriana was a friend, that there was nothing romantic there and never had been. Priya said she believed me, but the weighted tone stayed. I kept making excuses for how she talked about Adriana. I told myself it was just insecurity, that I could manage it by being reassuring, that it would settle once she felt more secure in the relationship. It didn't settle, it grew. The second warning sign was the phone. This one happened gradually enough that I didn't register it as a pattern until I was well inside it. It started with her seeing a message come in from someone I hadn't mentioned and asking casually who it was. That's normal. That happens, I told her. Then it became asking to see the message. Then it became checking my phone when she had a question about something, just quickly, while I was in another room. Then one evening I came out of the shower and she was sitting on the bed holding my phone and reading through a conversation thread. I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" She said without looking up, "You texted someone named Kara. I don't know who that is." Kara was a colleague. I told her that. She said, "You never mentioned her." I said, "I don't mention everyone I work with." She put the phone down and looked at me. She said, "I'm not comfortable not knowing who you're in contact with." I said, "I'm not comfortable with you going through my phone." She said, "Then maybe we have incompatible needs." That was a phrase she deployed often. Incompatible needs. It was a way of making her requirements sound like a legitimate item on a list of equal things, and my objection to them sound like my own failing. It's a clean rhetorical move. I didn't see it as a move for a long time. I just kept trying to address the needs. I gave her my phone password. I told myself it was a gesture of trust, that it would help her feel secure. It did not help her feel secure. It gave her the ability to check more frequently and the sense that checking was a right she'd been granted. The career thing is important to this story, and I don't want to gloss over it. About a year and a half into living together, I was approached about a position at a competing firm. Senior level, significant pay increase, more interesting work. The catch was that it was in another city about a 4-hour drive. Not another country, not even another coast, but a move. Priya didn't want to move. Her job was there, her circle was there, and she said plainly that she wasn't prepared to uproot her life for my career. I turned it down. I want to be clear that she didn't force me to turn it down. She didn't issue an ultimatum. She just stated very clearly what she was and wasn't willing to do, and I made a calculation. We'd been together 18 months. We were talking about engagement. I loved her. I decided the relationship was worth more than the job. I've thought about whether that was the wrong choice. Honestly, I'm not sure. What I know is that it was made based on a version of her that I thought was real, and that the version I thought was real was partly constructed. If I'd known who she was going to become, who she may have always been, I would have taken the job. But you make decisions with the information you have. We got engaged. I proposed. She said yes and cried in a way that felt genuine. I think it was genuine. I think she did love me. I think she loved me while also needing to control me, and I don't think those two things felt like a contradiction to her. The year of the engagement was the year the demands got more structured. Up until then, the controlling behavior had been ambient, atmospheric, the kind of thing you could tell yourself was just her communication style or her anxiety or something manageable. After we got engaged, it became explicit. She sat me down about 3 months after I proposed and told me she needed to talk about boundaries. I was receptive. I'd been in enough conversations about relationships by then to know that boundaries were a real thing that real couples needed to discuss. I sat down and I listened. She said she needed me to be more careful about emotional intimacy with female friends, that she didn't think it was appropriate for me to have close one-on-one friendships with women while we were planning a marriage. She said it was about respect and about making her feel like the primary relationship in my life. I said, "What do you mean by close?" She said, "Regular one-on-one time, ongoing personal conversations, things that should be happening inside our relationship instead." I said, "You're describing Adriana." She said, "I'm describing a pattern." I said, "You're asking me to end a friendship." She said, "I'm asking you to prioritize your marriage." She framed it, she almost always framed these things, in language that borrowed from a discourse about healthy relationships, about partners being each other's primary support, about emotional affairs being as real as physical ones, about women having the right to name what they needed. The problem with language like that is that the words are real and the concepts are real, but they can be pointed at anything. Emotional intimacy and priority and respect are real things in relationships, but they can also be invoked to justify demanding that your partner cut off a 14-year friendship because you're uncomfortable. And when you try to push back, you get accused of not caring about her feelings. I kept seeing Adriana. I was less open about it. I hated that. I hated having to be careful about a friendship that had never been anything other than a friendship, and I hated what that carefulness said about the state of things. Priya found out, I don't remember how. I think she saw a mention on my calendar, and the argument that followed was long and circular in the way her arguments always were. She was calm. That's what made them so hard. She was always calm. She never yelled, never said anything that would clearly qualify as unreasonable. She just kept restating her position and framing my objection to it as evidence that I didn't understand the seriousness of her feelings. She said that night, "If you can't do this for me, I need to think about whether this marriage is what I thought it was." I'd heard versions of that before. If I can't have your password, if you can't prioritize me, if you can't understand why this matters. She used the relationship as a chip on the table. Every time I didn't comply with something, the relationship itself was held over it. I gave in. I pulled back from Adriana. Not completely, not immediately, but enough that the friendship thinned out. Adriana noticed. She asked me once gently if everything was okay. I said yes and changed the subject. I felt guilty about that for years. The marriage happened. It was a good wedding, actually. I felt genuinely happy that day. I held onto that for a long time as evidence that the thing we had was real, that the problems were manageable, that I was being too negative about something that also contained genuine joy. The 2 years of marriage before the vacation were a slow erosion. She monitored my location. She had access to my phone and she used it. When I came home later than I'd said I would, for any reason, traffic, a long meeting, stopping to get gas, I was questioned about it in a way that felt more like an accounting than a conversation. What time did I leave? Who was I with? Had I spoken to anyone she didn't know? I started preemptively texting her my schedule. Departure times, meeting schedules, estimated arrivals. I did it to avoid the questions. I knew, even while I was doing it, that this wasn't a normal thing to do in a healthy relationship. I told myself it was a management strategy, that it was easier than the alternative, that the alternative wasn't really that bad anyway. The feminist framing came up whenever I tried to push back directly. And I want to explain what I mean by that because it's important, and I don't want to sound like I'm making a cheap point about feminism, which I'm not. There's a real version of the argument she was making. Women do face real issues in relationships. Jealousy can be a response to genuine patterns. Having needs and naming them is not inherently wrong. All of that is true. But Priya used the language and framework of those truths to insulate herself from any accountability. When I said she was monitoring me, she said she was protecting herself in a world where women are routinely deceived. When I said her demands were controlling, she said I was using a word that gets applied to women unfairly when they simply know what they need. When I pointed out something specific and concrete that she'd done, she'd reframe it as a response to something I'd failed to provide. Every complaint I had became a symptom of something I was doing wrong. The conversation never stayed on the thing I'd raised. It always migrated, smoothly and quickly, to a larger context in which I was the one who needed to reckon with something. I stopped raising things. I absorbed them instead. That was my mistake. I should have pushed harder earlier, gone to a counselor, forced the conversation to stay on the actual behavior. But I'd been trained over years of these conversations to expect the migration, and the exhaustion of anticipating it made it easier to just not start. Our neighbor in the building where we lived was a woman named Elaine. She was in her mid-50s, widowed, had lived in that building for almost 20 years. We'd been cordial from the start. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed things without being nosy. She'd leave a note if a package was sitting out. She'd knock if she heard something that sounded wrong. She had a quiet way of paying attention that felt like care rather than surveillance. Elaine had seen things. I didn't know the full extent of what she'd seen until later, but she'd noticed, over the 2 years we lived in that building, the pattern of it. The way I moved through the building when Priya wasn't with me versus when she was. The conversations she'd sometimes overheard through the thin walls of the hallway. The night she'd passed our door and heard Priya's calm, relentless voice going for what seemed like hours. She'd filed that all away. The vacation was Priya's idea. Portugal, the Algarve coast, a rental villa, 10 days. She'd planned the whole thing, which was how our trips always went. I didn't mind. Planning trips was something she genuinely enjoyed, and I didn't have strong opinions about destinations. We flew out in early September. The first 3 days were fine or fine enough. The coast was beautiful. We ate well. We swam. There were stretches that felt like the early version of us, the one I'd married in my head, and I held onto those stretches. The crack came on the 4th day. I'd gone for an early morning run while Priya was still asleep. I ran along the coastal path, met a couple at a viewpoint who were also running, ended up jogging with them for about 20 minutes while we all looked at the same stretch of ocean from the same angle. Their names were Marcus and Ellen. They were from Germany, celebrating their 10th anniversary. We talked about nothing important. We went our separate ways. I got back to the villa and mentioned it over breakfast, just as a thing that had happened, a nice chance encounter. Priya said, "Who was the woman?" I said, "I just told you they were a couple." She said, "You mentioned the husband's name first." I said, "What?" She said, "You said Marcus and Ellen. You remembered his name first." I sat with that for a moment. I genuinely didn't know what to do with that level of surveillance applied to the order in which I'd relayed two names. I said, "Priya, they were strangers on a running path. I talked to them for 20 minutes. She said, "You have a pattern of downplaying female friendships." I said, "This woman was on vacation with her husband. I will never see her again." She said, "That's not really the point." The argument moved from breakfast to the villa's small patio to the beach below, because I needed air and she followed. On the beach there were other people, not crowded. It was still early, but scattered families and couples within range. She didn't lower her voice. She said again that she needed me to cut contact with female friends, that Adriana was still in my life in ways she considered inappropriate, that she had spoken to Adriana on the phone once and Adriana had been oddly comfortable with her, which she found suspicious. She said she had been patient and that her patience had a limit. I said, "Adriana has done nothing wrong." She said, "She's a threat to this marriage." I said, "You are a threat to this marriage." That came out flat and clear, and I didn't take it back. She looked at me. A family with 2 small kids was setting up chairs about 10 meters away. An older man was reading a book in the low morning light. She said, "Excuse me." I said, "What you're doing right now, following me to a beach in Portugal to continue a fight about a woman I ran past on a path. This is the threat." She said in a very controlled voice, "I am expressing my needs." I said, "You're issuing demands and you've been issuing them since before we got married, and I have been complying with them for years, and it has not made you feel more secure. It has made you more certain that compliance is available." She said, "So now I'm the problem." I said, "Yes, on this specific thing, yes." She turned and walked back to the villa. I sat on the beach. The family with the kids was stealing looks at me. The older man had lowered his book. I stared at the water for a while. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry exactly. I felt something that was closer to relief than anything else, which surprised me. Like something that had been held under pressure had finally been allowed to expand. The rest of the trip was cold. We existed in parallel in the villa. We had 2 more days of scheduled activities that we attended in silence or near silence. The flight home was long. I called a divorce attorney within the month. I want to explain the legal part because the financial consequences are relevant. When we divorced, Priya requested spousal support. She'd been working throughout the marriage but at a lower salary than mine, and there's a legal framework around that. She had a case, at least on the surface. But Elaine testified. That's the part I didn't expect and the part that changed the outcome. When my attorney started the process, they asked if I had any witnesses to the dynamics of the marriage. I mentioned Elaine. My attorney contacted her. Elaine agreed to provide a written statement and to appear if needed. Her statement was specific and detailed. It documented 2 incidents where she had directly witnessed or heard the controlling behavior: the long one-sided arguments through the hallway wall, a specific night where she'd watched Priya physically take my phone out of my jacket pocket in the building lobby when she thought no one was watching. She described the general observable pattern of the relationship with the precision of someone who had paid attention for 2 years without agenda. The judge who handled our case was not required to factor any of this into a spousal support decision, and the divorce attorney was honest with me about that. But the combination of the documented history and Elaine's testimony created a picture of the marriage that made Priya's characterization of herself as the primary victim of a failing relationship very difficult to sustain. The spousal support request was denied. Priya's attorney sent a letter after the ruling that described the decision as biased and gendered, that the testimony of a neighbor had been given disproportionate weight, that Priya had been held to a standard that men in similar situations would not have faced. I read the letter once and put it down. There's an irony in it that isn't lost on me. She used the language of her own oppression to try to protect behavior that was genuinely oppressive. She had done that throughout the marriage, named real social dynamics and then pointed them inward, using them as a force field against accountability. And at the end, when the accountability finally arrived, she reached for the same language one more time. It didn't work, not this time. I've spent a lot of time, in the year and a half since the divorce was finalized, trying to understand what I cost myself by staying in it as long as I did. The career question comes up a lot in that accounting. There was the opportunity I'd turned down before we got married. There were 2 others, smaller, that I'd let pass during the marriage because pursuing them would have required more independence and autonomy than Priya would have found acceptable, and I didn't have the energy to fight that fight on top of everything else. I'm working on rebuilding those career things now. Slowly. The job market is what it is, and I'm not starting from zero, but I'm also starting from a different place than I would have been if the last 6 years had gone differently. I called Adriana about a month after the divorce was finalized. I told her what had happened. I apologized for the years where I'd been a diminished version of a friend because I was managing my marriage. She said she'd always known something wasn't right and that she'd been waiting for the call. We got lunch. It was easy in the way it used to be back when things were easy. I don't feel nothing when I think about Priya. I want to be honest about that. I feel something that I think is grief, even now. Not for the marriage as it was, but for the marriage I thought I was building when I proposed. The version of us in my head on the day of our wedding. That's the thing that's hardest to grieve because it was never entirely real. She was real. The love was real. The control was also real, and the love and the control were never separate from each other in the way I kept hoping they would be. She needed to hold me tightly because she loved me, and the holding was what eventually made it impossible to stay. I don't think she's a bad person. I want to say that clearly. I think she's a person with a set of fears that she never properly examined, who found justifications for behavior that those fears drove her toward, and who lost a marriage because she held it too hard. Elaine left me a note after the divorce was finalized. She slid it under my door. It said she hoped things were going better and that she was glad she'd said something. She said, "I almost didn't, but something about watching you over these years made me want you to have someone in your corner." That note made me cry in a way I hadn't cried through the whole process. I don't entirely know why. Something about being seen, I think, by someone with nothing to gain from it. I moved out of that building eventually. New place, new start. I kept in touch with Elaine. We have lunch every couple of months. She's wry and blunt, and she doesn't treat me like someone who needs managing, which, after 6 years of someone who did, is the most restful thing in the world. I'm taking care of myself better than I was. I'm working more, spending time with people I'd let drift, saying yes to things I used to decline because the decline was easier. I went on a work trip for the first time in years without orchestrating my schedule around someone else's anxiety. I'm not going to pretend it all feels clean and resolved. Some of it still feels jagged. Some mornings I wake up and the first thought is something from the marriage, an argument, a moment where I folded when I shouldn't have, a version of myself that I'm still not totally comfortable looking at. That person kept accommodating because accommodation felt like love. He wasn't wrong that love sometimes requires accommodation. He was wrong about how much and about the direction it was running. But I'm not angry at him either. He did what he thought was right with what he knew. When he finally knew enough, he did what was right too. The beach in Portugal was the moment. Sitting on the sand after she walked away, staring at water I'd never seen before, with strangers around me who had no idea they were witnessing anything. That was the moment I stopped trying to manage something that couldn't be managed. I didn't walk back to the villa right away. I sat for probably 40 minutes. I watched the family with the kids build something in the sand. I watched the old man finish his chapter and start another. I watched the light change on the water. And then I went back to the villa, and I started figuring out how to leave. That's the whole story. 6 years, one controlled exit, one neighbor who paid attention, one ruling that said no, and a man on the other side of it who is slowly, deliberately, building something that actually belongs to him. That's enough. That's more than enough.